Quotes a U.S. squad leader explaining sort of the difference between what it's like, at these higher levels where the 17 to 25 human beings it takes to support every combat man at the front line, what it's like for them at a war level, and what it's like for the guy who's the squad leader and the people who are in his squad. Bergeric quotes this American squad leader, but this is exactly how it was for the Australians too, as saying, quote, "The squad leader, a corporal or sergeant, is the man who sees that the assault orders are executed. Reams and reams of paper are used to write orders from the highest authority down, telling everyone what to do and how to do it. They have predictable phrases: take and occupy, assault and capture, operations orders, annexes to the operations orders, etc. The squad leader never sees the reams of paper consisting of brilliant orders written by officers who've attended every war college in the world. The annexes to the orders cover everything from battery voltage in handheld radios to the rolls of toilet paper that will be available. These orders and annexes are sent to the war colleges, the archives, and the big file in the sky, but the snuffy squad leader doesn't care a tinker's damn about them. When push comes to pull," he says, "the lieutenant or platoon leader tells his squad leaders, when I give you the word, first squad, move out in that direction. Second squad, keep contact with first squad's right flank and move out. Third squad will be in reserve for now. Got any questions?" Everyone is thinking to themselves, he says, "Yeah, can I go home now?" So the lieutenant says, "Move out." The squad leader tells his 12 or so men, "So-and-so, Joe, move out. Number 2 is John," and so on. An enemy machine gunner is pounding like hell at you. One of your snuffies says, "Jesus Christ, Sarge, you're gonna kill every one of us." You yell back, "That's right, move out and get killed, or I'll have to kill you." And so it goes. All of those a-holes, he says, or most of them, who wrote all of those brilliant operations orders were never squad leaders. The way the war appears depends on the zoom level you look at it. And you can look at it from any zoom level you want. That is the ground level, squad level zoom level, the people actually fighting. But you can zoom in and out to any degree you want. I mean, I can pick up a book I hardly ever have out of my arm's reach, the Encyclopedia of Military History with Trevor Dupuy writing it. And he'll give you the satellite level zoom out and just explain the campaign sort of in very quick and general fashion, but you don't get any sense of what it was like for the people on the ground. But maybe an overview is worth it here in Australia to show what happens. As we said, the Australians are fighting with the Chacos, these people who are like reservists who have to kind of hold back the Japanese long enough for Australian troops who are being, some of them anyway, withdrawn from the Mediterranean, brought back to Australia for a quick refit, and they're going to be sent to help. And here's the way Dupuy puts the, this initial part of the Dakota campaign. It doesn't sound very dramatic the way he says it, though, but it is an encyclopedia after all. Quote, July 21st to September 13th, 1942. Advance on Port Moresby. Elements of the Japanese 18th Army under Major General Tomotaro Hori pressed inland from Gona, drove in local Allied troops, and moved up the rugged Dakota Trail to seize the key pass over the Owen Stanley Mountains, which happened on August 12th. Pushing ahead, he writes, the Japanese reached to within 30 miles of Port Moresby before stiffening Australian and American resistance under Australian Major General Edmund F. Herring, supported by tactical air forces with local air superiority, halted the advance. End quote. That doesn't really give you a sense of the drama and the impressive jungle fighting evolved, I've always found that for that, you need to turn to either the soldiers on the ground who are doing the fighting in their accounts, or the stories of the war correspondents who were often the ones who wrote those accounts down. For example, Australian war correspondent George H. Johnston was there on the ground. His dispatches were eventually cataloged in a book called The Toughest Fighting in the World. And he, at the time, writing in contemporary terms as he's finding stuff out with the troops, starts seeing the survivors of some of these conflicts up on the Kokoda track in the Owen Stanley Mountains come shuffling down from the jungle. He says, quote, "Our wounded are beginning to come back from the Owen Stanleys. Thin, bearded, gaunt men with hollow cheeks and the marks of strain and pain around their eyes. Their uniforms are ripped and covered with dried mud. Their slouch hats are pulpy and shapeless. Stretcher cases are jolting back on crude log litters on the shoulders of brawny Papuan natives. The others have walked all the way along the terrible track that links Mooresville with Dakota. They don't try to conceal what they've been through. It's only by realizing the difficulties our troops are facing that we shall be able to overcome them." Now quoting one of the troops, quote, "Up there we've been fighting on the worst battleground in the world," one man said. "Before I was hit, I spent 46 hours without shutting an eye. There are mists creeping over the trees all day, and sometimes you can't see your hand in front of your face under the cover of the jungle. Most of our chaps haven't seen a Jap. You don't even see the Jap who gets you. It's like fighting the invisible man. Those Japs are tough, hard fighters, and their camouflage is perfect. They can move through scrub or tall grass without making a sound, and without showing a sign, except, if your eyes are good, an occasional stirring in the vegetation. My unit made 2 attacks on Japanese positions. We got to within 15 feet of them, but we still couldn't see them. When they were attacking, we could hear a voice shouting from some distance. We soon learned that trick. The voice always comes from a long way back, but the real danger is the Jap force right up close to you. The Japs have amazing patience. They will lie on the ground or stand in a creek up to their necks in water all day without moving, just waiting to catch you off guard. They use the old trick of calling out false orders, and sometimes they begin jabbering at you from only a few yards away. If you stood up to cover them with your rifle, a sniper would take a crack at you from a different direction. All over us, but they've got 5 times the number of men we have." End quote. The false orders thing is wild. A lot of these Japanese troops had a person or two in the units who spoke English, and they would yell out orders to see if they could get some of the enemy, usually absolutely exhausted and tired and on the edge of their, nerves, to see if they could get them to stand up or start moving and then open fire on it. It's vicious. It's that kind of fighting. The Australians run into the same trick with Japanese wounded that other Allied troops have run into. The story of a wounded soldier calling out for help. An Australian officer goes over to try to help him, and the Japanese soldier throws a grenade at him from close range. Once again, that poisons the well for any other Japanese who might legitimately want to surrender and get medical treatment or anything like that. And the Australians start doing what the British and the Americans have already begun doing in their theaters, not taking any chances. I remember one soldier saying, "We just never stopped watching Japanese dead." Through with bayonets and shoot at the corpses. It was a little like having vampires rise from the grave. They just never knew when it was safe to consider, a corpse a corpse. For those who are scholars of the Dakota campaign, they know how many revisionist books over the years have been written about so many of the aspects of the fighting. I mean, were they really outnumbered as bad as the old stories say, and all that kind of stuff. I just want to say that as an American, I find that somewhat distracting. The situation here that makes it heroic, it's not being so outnumbered, it's literally what they went through. You read these accounts what these soldiers are dealing with. It's upsetting and horrifying in a way that you just didn't run into, as I've said many times now already, in other theaters. And I should also, to be fair, as Osmar White said, my geography is impartial. This is happening to the Japanese too. lot more of the situation. There's a lot going on in this theater, as we said. On August 7th is when the Marine landing. About 850 miles to the east of here happens, right in this one theater on Guadalcanal. We've already talked a little bit about that. And then the Japanese will try to land at Milne Bay, and another part of this same area of New Guinea, to capture an airfield, and the Australians throw them back, becoming this is famous, although I think I've heard it about it. I think it is, becoming the first of the Allied troops to sort of deny the Japanese something that they're trying to take in this war. The scale of the fighting reminds one of a very large Vietnam War campaign. So the Kokoda fighting will have like 6,000, 7,000 Japanese troops against 2,000 or 3,000 Australians for a certain point. It seems like small potatoes compared to other fronts, but you can't have large potatoes on this front because you can't feed anybody, right? You want to put 4 or 5 divisions, well, you don't have the transport to do it, and they die after you drop them off there, right? So this is how you're going to take this area with about that many troops. The Japanese are slowly but surely going to start to get pushed back over the mountains in the other direction, back down toward their bases on the north of the island. Part of the reason for this is because the Marines on Guadalcanal have made this entire theater something that the Japanese press. And sometimes when they're trying to reinforce Guadalcanal against the Marines, they can't reinforce New Guinea to the same degree. So they're starting to ping off of each other and take pressure off of each other. Also, the Milne Bay battle that we just discussed, that's where you start to see Americans on the ground fighting next to Australians and with them. This is not widely understood in the United States. In Milne Bay, it's more engineers and anti-aircraft gunners, but you're going to see more and more of that. Also, and this is a bit of a sore point in a lot of Australia's soldiers' minds, there will be criticism from people like General MacArthur in Australia, who will say things like, the Australians aren't fighting well, you know, that they're not good troops and all these kinds of things, completely neglecting that these are militia going into combat for the first time against Japanese veterans who've been there before. Wait till he sees what the Australian tip of the spear guys can do when they get there. They start arriving little by little, and as this campaign you start to see the really good Australian troops and the good Japanese troops. There's a line that I loved, I believe it was quoted in Harry Bergeron's book, where they asked a veteran who was talking about, you know, how they ranked the jungle fighters, and after a while, it was always thought the Japanese were now these super jungle fighters. After a while, they will say that the Australians are the best jungle fighters. The Japanese are the second best jungle fighters of the war, and that the Americans really you can't judge because they sort of knock the jungle down first and then fight in what's left. But once the tables turn a little bit and aircraft play a big role in this, you'll start to see the Japanese suffer. And they're going to suffer in a way that will be cataloged, you know, Zhao Matsutsuku's book. He'll call the fighting on Kokoda, he'll say his great memories of the entire campaign is one of suicides and mercy killings. Like if you the Japanese memory of this place. And as the fighting continues, the Japanese are not just fighting, you know, the European allied troops, they're fighting the natives in green armor. Osmar White has a little blurb that just reminds you that these natives, they remind me a lot of the Polynesians. A lot of the Polynesians are the most friendliest, most open, most hospitable kinds of people you will ever want to meet. But don't make them mad, right? If you make them mad, they can be just, well, here's what Osmar White talks about. He talks about fighting with the Australian troops, and his name is Lick Lick. And White says, quote, with him, meaning that one people in the story, was a small, hot black native about 4 feet 9 inches tall named Lick Lick, a cheerful-looking creature with a grin that spread right around his head. Paddles, the other person, said that Lick Lick was being sent to trace and told us about his offense. In a raid on Salamaua on July 1st, Lick Lick begged to be allowed to carry ammunition for his boss. Eventually, permission was given. Doing great steadiness and courage as number 2 to a Tommy gun. He killed 2 Japanese with a bush knife, then he disappeared. Our troops had withdrawn by 9 o'clock in the morning. Lick Lick was missing at the rendezvous. Just before the last men moved off, he arrived exhausted, dragging a bulging copra sack. It contained 13 Japanese heads. He then had the effrontery to ask for leave, so that he could take them back to his village in the hills and hang them on the pole of the, he described it as a men's clubhouse. When, in the course of his dressing down, it was pointed out to him that very little credit would devolve on him for cutting off the heads of men killed by other warriors, he replied simply, "But they were not dead, boss. They were only wounded." End quote. So Lick Lick had gone out there, killed the wounded, and cut off their heads. There were stories of natives wanting Japanese heads so badly that they, lacking knives, sometimes would carry them to the tree with a fork in the trunk, wedge their neck into the fork and spin the body around until the head popped off. Whole Japanese patrols will go missing soon, only to be found later as rotting skeletons with the jungle vegetation growing all through them. Like I said, a little like Polynesians, sometimes wonderful, hospitable, people who seem so innocent and human. It's almost like Eden before the fall, right? Don't make them mad. What eventually begins to turn the tide in New Guinea is something that is beginning to turn the tide against the Axis in the whole war, everywhere you look. It's the non-sexy stuff. We've been talking about it this whole series, haven't we? The Marine Corps General Robert Barrow had a great line. He just echoes what generals have said forever. He says, amateurs think about tactics, but professionals think about logistics. And in New Guinea, you can see the Australians slowly but surely building up their strength, bringing in new, good units from the Mediterranean and places like that. The Americans bringing more troops in Guadalcanal. You're going to see the Marines eventually give way to Army troops. And all of this is part of what will begin to simply stop the Axis impetus. And the things that the Axis had going for it were things like the momentum, the initial surprise, the wonderful cutting edge, and the head start that their militaries often had to be prepared for. Do you remember the Japanese have been fighting in China for years, right? That creates a bunch of veterans. The Germans had a war machine. It's just awesome. But they needed these things to compensate for what they didn't have, because this is, on paper, not a fair fight, the Axis against the Allies. We've been saying it all along, right? The Allies have an advantage, a huge advantage in population, economic power, industrial capability, natural resources, the geographic distribution of things like their bases and support areas. These are not immaterial. It's part of the Axis went to war, right, to redress some of that imbalance as they saw it. But in a war of attrition, which Eric Bergman says the Pacific is going to be, once the impetus of the Japanese is stopped, these are the things that are important. And the Japanese begin to start the process of seeing what being ground down means. The Germans are getting the same experience with their Axis partners in Europe. As everyone who studies the European war knows, that they'd already failed to take Moscow at the 1941-42 winter, and a lot of people look at that as lost their impetus. They will try to regain that impetus as part of the big summer 1942 offensives, and of course that ends up with Stalingrad, and we all know how that turns out. But I mean, you look at the difference, compare how things look from the Axis side on the first day of the year, 1942, January 1st, 1942, to how things look from the Axis side on December 31st, the last day of the year, 1942. It is night and day. What changed? The Axis impetus had stalled, the sides had sort of crystallized, and now you have a grinding war of attrition. And in a grinding war of attrition, the side with the most stuff, the better ability to bring that stuff and transport it to where you need it, the ability to resupply, all these things begin to tell. And many of the battles in the last 6 months of the Pacific War here in New Guinea and the Solomon Islands is the grinding down stuff. I mean, in Guadalcanal, there's going to be something like 7 larger naval battles and 3 larger land battles, but almost all of them are connected to, one way or another, trying to resupply the island. The side that can keep bringing in fresh troops and replacements and supplies is going to win. In Guadalcanal, you get this wild situation for a while. I like the way author Richard B. Frank in Guadalcanal describes it. He says it's a mutual siege. So 12 hours of the day, the Allied forces are under siege. The other 12 hours of the day, the Japanese forces are under siege. And it's a night and day question. At night, the Allied forces are under siege. At the daytime, the Axis forces are under siege. Frank writes this, and when he says cactus flyers, by the way, on Guadalcanal, he's talking about the pilots who are flying off of Henderson Field, this air base that is the sort of at the center of the marine perimeter on Guadalcanal that they're defending. And he writes, quote, "Because of the efforts of the cactus flyers and the lack of efforts by American admirals, a curious tactical situation arose in the waters around Guadalcanal. A change of sea command every 12 hours, creating a sort of mutual siege. By day, American ships plied the channel between Tulagi and Guadalcanal, and transports arrived to unload, keeping a wary eye cocked for Japanese aircraft. At sundown, all the ships flying the Stars and Stripes exited hastily to the east, or sought the haven of Tulagi's harbor, quote, like frightened children running home from a graveyard, end quote, in the words of Samuel Eliot Morison, end quote." Now we're going to talk about Iron Bottom Sound for a minute. A couple of ships. Iron Bottom Sound was the name given to an area where so many ships had sunk and said it had an iron bottom that's around these islands. He says, quote, "Shortly after darkness, Japanese men of war heaved into Iron Bottom Sound, which they'd ruled unchallenged since August 9th, with the unhappy exception of Blue and Henley. There they would favor their countrymen with rice, bullets, and soldiers, and the Americans with a bombardment. These operations achieved the regularity of a crack railroad run, and disgusted Marines labeled them the Cactus Express, soon better known as the Tokyo Express." End quote. In other words, both sides are trying to keep their troops resupplied and reinforced. And the side that stops being able to do this is going to be the side that loses. That's what happens in a war of attrition, right? Eventually, one side's worn down to the nub and the other isn't. And this is where our description of this war is probably going to deviate from a lot of the TV specials you see, or things from documentaries, because wars of attrition tend not to be all that interesting from a tactical and strategic standpoint. There's a workmanlike way about them. I like the way Eric Bergeret, of course, how many times have I said that, describes it. First, he points out that there is no real front line in most of these battles like you might have in Europe or North Africa, because the jungle is just too darn easy to infiltrate through. So what the sides and all do is create perimeters, like the Marines on Guadalcanal. A perimeter is something where you create a circular defense area where everyone's facing outward. And that way, even if somebody comes from the jungle and infiltrates and outflanks you, you're not surrounded. So you have perimeters, and the other thing you have are patrols. Patrols are the only way intelligence is gathered by the officers on the ground. They send out squads, usually of soldiers who will go out in different directions and try to see where the enemy is, make contact with them if they have an advantage. And that's what this war devolves into, which makes it not so interesting from the General MacArthur level, because, as I said, workmanlike, right? Patrols go out all the time. They run into the enemy. The firefights quick and deadly and over. And that just continues on and on. Eric Bergeret writes, quote, "The small unit war of patrolling and watching the perimeter had a brutal pace. During a campaign, there was no let-up in the activity or the violence. The Japanese landed at Buna and started over the Owen Stanley Mountains in July 1942. Rabaul was bypassed in early 1944. In the time between, significant contact existed between Allied and Japanese ground forces every day. Although punctuated with a small number of massed Japanese assaults, the war in the South Pacific was a war of attrition. Day in and out, soldiers were killed, maimed, or stricken with fearful disease. Many characteristics of the war, he continues, such as the immense casualty rates, the poor replacement system, the hideous climate, and malignant terrain, all worked to push the armies towards exhaustion. Yet the soldiers fought the land war in the Pacific with a savage and relentless intensity that had no parallel in World War II. Although it is possible to identify incidents of restraint and humanity on both sides, the essence of the conflict was something very close to a war of annihilation. End quote. So even though we've taken quite a long time to get to this point, we're going to be moving rather quickly for a while because there's a sameness to things. And my apologies to everyone out there whose grandfather or great-grandfather fought in one of these campaigns. We're going to hop over like the island hopping the U.S. Navy is going to do. But these island fighting situations are very similar. Author James Jones, who fought on Guadalcanal, said it was like a choreographed military ballet to a certain point. You land on the island, you isolate the island, you cut the island into pieces, and then you begin slowly but surely wiping out the defenders. This is part of why, as Eric Berger had said, it's a war of annihilation, because unlike many other theaters in the war, the goal is not the same. In those situations, the goal is to break the enemy. There's lots of ways to do it, right? You outflank them, you get in the rear, you hit them at decisive points, you take strategic objectives that screw up their defense lines, whatever it might be. But once you get the enemy to flee, run, retreat, rout, whatever it might be, that's where the real killing starts. Think about the Highway of Death in Iraq, or the Falaise Pocket in 1944. That's where a ton of damage happens. The reason this theater is different is because the Japanese don't run. Alone amongst the great armies of the world, the Japanese morale is for all intents and purposes unbreakable, which means you have to go around and kill them all. You have to wipe out each position one by one by one. It's a combination of workmanlike and extremely deadly. And it creates a sense of fatalism amongst the troops, which is normal in war, but of a level that you don't see. That's why, again, the Pacific War veterans are different. I remember the wonderful series I saw from Britain called Hell in the Pacific, where they interviewed some of the American veterans, and one of them just says, we were crafted to be a machine, and each one of us were working parts, and we killed. That's what we did. We were a killing machine. In that same wonderful documentary by one of my favorite people to ever talk about the Pacific War, Eugene Sledge, who was a Marine, he described the front lines this way, and I've never forgotten it. He said, quote, "The front line is really where the war is, and anybody 100 yards behind the front lines doesn't really know what it's like." End quote. Now that statement is meant to denigrate all the people behind the front lines, because I think, as we said earlier, 17 to 25 individuals is what it takes to keep someone at the front line, and those people could be killed or in danger at any time. But those people... Such are we humans, such is our nature, that we can look back on moments where we fairly did not, and remember them with nostalgia and pleasure. The truth is, 35 years, just like this, 35 years has lost it all, and given World War II a polishing glow that it did not have at the time. The process of history always makes me think of the way now when those polished their turbines. They put the raw chunks in the barrel, half filled with bird shrimps, and then turn the barrel, and keep turning it until the rough edges are all taken off and the nuggets come out smooth and shiny. Time, I think, does the same thing with history, and especially with wars. He then goes on to do something that you have previously done in history. He explains